Before we start the episode, just want to say thank you very much to everybody that took part in the Help the Homeless Coronavirus Popular Front raffle. We raised over £4,700. All of that has been sent off to 3 different charities: Big Issue Foundation, Crisis and Shelter. So thank you very much. The winner of the raffle will be announced on all our platforms by the end of this month, probably next week. But yeah, cheers. This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict, with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to researcher and analyst Aaron Zelin. Zelin is, in my opinion, one of the best people researching when it comes to understanding militant jihadism. He's also the guy that runs jihadology.net. If you know Popular Front, you probably know about jihadology. Today, Aaron is going to be speaking about Tunisian jihad, something we don't actually hear that much of, but something that has had a big influence within Qaeda, ISIS, and even in the wars in Chechnya to some degree and the Balkans. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please do consider supporting us to keep it all going at patreon.com/popularfront. So I was thinking first, before we really get into kind of the modern day era with ISIS and what have you, maybe it would be useful if you can go into the history of Tunisia and jihad there specifically, because, you know, like I was just saying, it's not really the sort of place that people think of when they think of militant jihadism.
Yeah, so you started to first see Tunisians getting involved in the jihadi movement in the 1980s in Afghanistan. Compared to other, nationalities, though, like Egyptians or Saudis or Yemenis, they weren't like a huge amount of people. You saw first sort of a trickle in the early to mid 80s, but most of the Tunisians that ended up getting to Afghanistan actually got there like toward the end of the conflict in the late 80s. So they didn't really get that same taste that necessarily some of the earlier people did. And because there wasn't a large amount of people, you didn't see like this robust movement at the time in the same way you saw with different groups being created within Afghanistan. There was never any specific group created by the Tunisians in Afghanistan in the 80s. Part of that is because there was a lot of infighting between them. There's this funny quote from Abu Musab al-Suri, who's one of the key theoreticians of the jihadi movement globally. In its history, and he talked about how these guys were essentially just extremists themselves amongst the jihadi clan, and that they would fight with each other, and therefore they didn't have that much organization. You only really started to see them developing more cohesion and organization in the 1990s after a number of them went to Europe instead of going back to Tunisia. Because in the late 80s, it's important to note also that the then new government led by then President Ben Ali, who came into power in the late 80s, did this large-scale crackdown on sort of the more mainstream Islamists of Ennahda, which is the Tunisian Muslim Brotherhood equivalent, essentially. And as a result, if the jihadis that went to Afghanistan went back, they would have been cracked down upon harshly as well. And therefore, many of them claimed asylum or went over there as migrants. And then you started to see Tunisians getting involved in a more serious manner and in a more professional manner in many respects in relation to the Bosnian conflict. And you saw a number of Tunisians going over to Bosnia to be fighters. But more importantly, which is what sort of became the MO or tradecraft of the Tunisians in Europe, was that they're highly involved in the recruitment, the facilitation, logistics, document forgery of the broader global movement. So one of the things to think about, you always hear about, Saudis and the Egyptians being key leaders, or Libyans and Palestinian Jordanians being sort of key ideologues in the movement historically. But you don't really hear about Tunisians that much. And part of that is because they're essentially these middlemen, and they're behind the scenes doing a lot of the sort of dirty work, I guess you could say, for lack of a better term, with these types of activities. So as a result, nobody that was necessarily outside of the movement really knew what was going on with them, and the fact that there wasn't too much activity within Tunisia, since much it was happening in relation to Europe and Bosnia, and then also assisting things with Algeria during the civil war there. You only started to see them becoming more of an actual like player when they ended up creating their own organization called the Tunisian Combatant Group in June 2000. And this is, of course, after the Taliban takes over Afghanistan. You started to see a bunch of foreign fighters and jihadis returning to Afghanistan in the late 1990s. So through the connections that were made within Europe, you saw the organization, the TCG, being founded by Abu Ayyad al-Tunisi, alongside Tarek Maroufi. And Abu Ayyad was based in London, Tarek Maroufi was based in Brussels, but they also had a key epicenter in Milan as well. And that's where a lot of sort of the middleman activities were going on, since the strongest part of the network was based in Milan, Italy. So as a result of that, you started to see them, instead of directing people towards Bosnia or Algeria, and then really small amount to Chechnya, but back to people going to Afghanistan. And they set up a house in Jalalabad for recruits and sent them off to training camps. But one of the most significant things about this movement at the time was the fact that they're the ones who helped plan and execute the assassination of Ahmed Shah Massoud, who was the leader of the Northern Alliance, which was the group of people in Afghanistan that was fighting the Taliban at the time, but also an ally of the U.S. and Western powers, and likely would have been the key player that the U.S. would have used in the aftermath of the invasion post 9/11. And so this attack was being coordinated with Abu Hafs al-Masri, who was bin Laden's head of military activities within Al-Qaeda at the time, and they conducted this attack 2 days ahead of 9/11, this assassination. So you could see that even though people don't really think about Tunisians as these key individuals historically, but they've had a lot of key actions that they've been involved with that most people don't even realize. And I mean, another one is that after bin Laden originally left Afghanistan in 1992, he only kept one training camp around in Afghanistan, and that was actually run by a Tunisian and maintained by a Tunisian for the 4 years until he came back in 1996 after the Sudanese kicked him out, as well as the Taliban then taking power in parts of Afghanistan. So you had a number of Tunisians involved in activities, or they were doing things that people didn't realize. And then post 9/11, you sort of had this new generation of individuals getting involved that didn't really have to do with these historic networks related to Afghanistan or what was going on in Europe. Of course, those players were still doing things as well, but you sort of had this younger generation that came of age post 9/11 in more of this securitized world, as well as in the context of the Intifada with what was going on in Israel and the Palestinians, but also then the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 and then the occupation there. And as a result, you start to see Tunisians within Tunisia getting involved and being interested in these types of activities, and being sent and facilitated through Syria to get into Iraq to go join up with Zarqawi's network, and essentially the Islamic State's predecessor group. But you also then started to see greater connections between Tunisians in Tunisia and sort of the Algerians, and sort of the post-Civil War networks in Algeria after the Civil War ended in the late 1990s. So this was the rise of the GSPC, which is what became AQIM. And you started to have Tunisians going to Algeria to train, to either be involved in plotting and attacks within Algeria, or to get training to then go to Iraq to join up with Zarqawi and the network there. And as a result, this sort of created the basis then for what we would see post 2011. So in about the decade prior to 2011 and the Tunisian revolution, there was a growth in prisoner population within Tunisia as a consequence of these activities. So you had Tunisians trying to go to Algeria or trying to go to Iraq, and they would be arrested, or they might be arrested within Algeria, or they might be arrested in Iraq or in Syria, and they would be sent back to Tunisia. Or you had cases where Tunisians had done their sentences within Europe, and when they're done with their sentences, they were then deported back to Tunisia. So you had sort of this congregation of this first generation of Tunisian jihadis within the prison system, alongside the second generation of Tunisian jihadis in the prison system between around 2003 to 2011. And you started to mix people and gain new experiences, and they started to sort of talk about what they would do whenever they got let out of prison. And this is also where Abu Ayyad continued to assert himself as a leader within this broader movement, because in the aftermath of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, he actually fled to Turkey and was actually based in Turkey for a little while, helping out with some of the attacks that Al-Qaeda was planning, you know, the Casablanca and the Madrid train bombing attacks. But he ended up getting arrested and sent back to Tunisia by the Turks in March 2003. So he was only really the early stages of the Madrid one. But if you actually look at the court documents related to the Casablanca attacks, he's directly implicated in planning related to it in Morocco. But because of this is when he was able to build himself up as a leader amongst the second generation as well, as they start to fill the prison system too, as a relation to, you know, the activities with the Iraq Jihad as well as the GSPC AQIM networks. And starting in around 2006, then you had more clear planning and ideas of what they were going to do. And part of this is because it was the 50th anniversary of Tunisia's independence from France. So as a result, President Ben Ali at the time let some people out of prison that were part of Ennahda, the Islamist movement that I was talking about previously. They didn't let jihadis out at the time, but, you know, on these anniversaries and things like that, you know, dictators like doing these things to show good gestures along those lines. But because of this, the jihadis in the prison system were thinking, you know, what are we going to actually do now if we actually get out? And that's where you started to see planning on what they would actually do. And some of it was based off of their own experiences, others was based off of sort of lessons learned that Al-Qaeda was implementing, or at least putting out on a theoretical level, based off of what they saw was the failures of what was happening in Iraq. And then, you know, what I call the original sin of the revolution is that after the revolution happened in mid to late February 2011, there was this general prisoner amnesty, which included people involved in jihadi-related activities. Obviously, I'm totally for letting out political prisoners, but I feel like there could have been a better method of maybe retrying the individuals involved in, you know, going to Afghanistan, Iraq, or involved in terrorist plots, what have you. But because of that, all these guys got let out into the streets, and there was a couple of thousand of them. And so then they're able to sort of implement their plans and then pretty much go from there after the revolution.
Right, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the highest number of foreign fighters come from Tunisia in regards to ISIS, right?
Yeah, so there was about 3,000 Tunisians that went to join up with ISIS in Syria, and then about 1,500 that went to Libya. So you could say the whole pool of people is, you know, up to 4,500 people. Of course, there are some people that were both in Libya and Syria at various points, so it's hard to know specifically. But if you look at that whole pool, it's definitely one of the higher groupings of individuals. And part of the reason why they were able to go there was for a variety of factors. One was related to these historical logistics and facilitation networks that Tunisians were involved in. So they're highly connected to all these people going to different places. And the thing is one of the things that happened in Iraq was that a lot of Tunisians started to take on more leadership positions too within jihadi groups. So by the time we saw what was going on in 2012 to 14 or so, the head of foreign fighter recruitment for the Islamic State was actually a Tunisian. This guy, Tariq al-Harzi, he had previously been involved in recruitment for ISIS as well in relation to foreign fighters, previously going as far back as maybe 2006, 7, 8 time period. So they already had these personal connections as well. And then for a period in like 2005, 6, the person that was helping move people through Turkey to get into Syria, to go into Iraq, was actually a Tunisian as well. So you had these various ways of connecting people also. Then, of course, you had what happened post-revolution, where you had this, opening of society. And what happened is there was this new group created that Abu Ayyad founded and was the leader of, called Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, and they're an al-Qaeda group. But based off of the particular conditions in Tunisia, and lessons learned from what they perceived as failures related to what Zarqawi was doing with the excessive violence in Iraq, they decided on sort of this dawah-first approach where they would do outreach and proselytization and lectures and social services and, you know, proto-governance type of activities within Tunisia to reach out to people, because they felt Tunisians wouldn't understand why they would necessarily need to do jihad. And this goes back to sort of the broader history of modern Tunisia. So after its founding in 1956 with founding President Habib Bourguiba, there was a series of secular reforms that essentially pushed Islam out of public life and mainly into people's private homes. And therefore, you know, people really didn't have a ton of like serious knowledge about, you know, like the orthodox understandings of Islam. And therefore, there was this dual process where, because of this opening, people were re-exploring things and they're curious about stuff, but also because people didn't necessarily have this buttressed sort of understanding of things, jihadis were able to sort of exploit it by saying, like, you know, these are the specific interpretations and blah, blah, blah. And they wouldn't necessarily have the context, especially younger people, that this might be a more extreme interpretation of how most people sort of look at Islamic scripture. So as a result, and then in line with the fact that they had this constituent assembly election to write a new constitution in October 2011, which was won by Ennahda, this Islamist party that I've been talking about. And based off of their own experience being cracked down upon by the Bin Ali regime previously, they felt that if they did the same thing to these guys in AST, then you know, in another 15 years, maybe they would be ones ruling the country in the same way that happened to Ennahda. So as a result, they came up with sort of this light touch approach, but in the same way that you might over the top crack down upon people and therefore create more grievances and greater radicalization and become more extreme, you know, doing a light touch approach does simply the same thing by providing the space for them to openly proselytize people, and therefore there's a greater population of potential people to get involved with AST originally than there would have been otherwise if, you know, a government treated them in the same way most governments would do for an al-Qaeda-like group and a terrorist organization. And as a result, for about 2.5 years, they're able to openly proselytize and recruit people to their own organization. And then once the Tunisian government, led by Ennahda, realized that, you know, this, you know, policy wasn't really working. You know, you saw the attack against the U.S. Embassy in Tunis in September 2012. Then there was 2 assassinations against secular leftist politicians in February and July 2013. And then also AST, because they had become relatively successful with their recruitment, they're starting to take away the Islamic legitimacy of Ennahda itself. So as a result, eventually by August 2013, the Tunisian government then designated AST as a terrorist organization because of the violence that some of its members were involved with. But it was also fortuitous timing because it was also, you know, in the context of what was going on in Syria. April 2013 was when ISIS went into Syria officially and overtly. Of course, you saw Tunisians going to Libya to join up and fight there and join up with the Ansar al-Sharia group in Libya. And you also saw Tunisians earlier joining up with Jabhat al-Nusra as well in Syria. But really the crackdown on AST is what really drove a lot of Tunisians to go abroad instead of staying at home, because either, you know, you'd have to stop your activism, you'd be arrested and thrown into prison, or maybe get involved in sort of this low-level insurgency that was building with AQIM in the border areas with Algeria. But it's never really amounted to too much. It's just been, you know, maybe 3 to 5 attacks a year usually, so it's not that large scale. So, you know, the most exciting thing was definitely going to Syria, and obviously when you know, understand the broader context of what was going on with everybody going to Syria too, is obviously the sexiest route to go. But the interesting thing is that, you know, as I said, AST was an al-Qaeda group, and then you had this issue with ISIS between al-Qaeda, but most Tunisians ended up going to ISIS. So ISIS was able to essentially take advantage of the work that al-Qaeda did in Tunisia and get people to get on their side, essentially. And part of this goes back to the fact that the tensions between al-Qaeda and ISIS in 2013 still weren't the same way they were post-February 2014 with the official split by al-Qaeda, in the way that Al-Qaeda talked about it. So it wasn't seen as necessarily this weird thing. But then you also have to go back to the history of Abu Ayyad and when he was in Afghanistan. And he actually knew Zarqawi then when Zarqawi had his training camps in Afghanistan as well. So there was this connection there between, Abu Ayyad and Zarqawi, and therefore his organization as well. And the thing, too, is before the April 2013 announcement of ISIS officially being in Syria, Abu Ayyad was calling for Tunisians and recruiting people to go to Iraq only to join up with the Islamic State of Iraq, which is what they're calling themselves, obviously, before they went into Syria and became ISIS. So it was complicated. And then also in the run-up to sort of the caliphate announcement, Abu Ayyad was being relatively neutral about this position because he thought that maybe Al-Qaeda could infiltrate ISIS and reform them. And he actually sent a letter to Ayman al-Zawahiri about this. Obviously, it sounds kind of funny thinking about it now. It's like, who's going to actually tell ISIS what to do considering the way that they think? But essentially, a month and a half after he sent this letter in August 2014, he sent another letter to Zawahiri as well as other leaders within the Al-Qaeda movement, essentially being like, yeah, scratch that. This isn't going to work. They're beyond bad type of deal. But by this point, already about 2,400 or so of the 3,000 Tunisians that ended up going to Syria had already been there. So his message wouldn't have even resonated by the time that he started actually banging against them. Because the thing to remember, too, in ISIS propaganda at the time is that anybody that was a leader within the Al-Qaeda movement was essentially being called Jews of jihad. So even if Abu Ayyad said something to Tunisians, be like, no, you should be with Jabhat al-Nusra instead of ISIS or whatever, his voice would have been irrelevant.
Right, and then did the Tunisians have like a prominent role in ISIS as they had before, like you said, in Afghanistan and various places?
Yeah, so because the Tunisians had, these experiences with AST as well as with ASL in Libya too, in regards to a lot of organization, doing social services, being involved in, lectures and stuff. You saw a lot of Tunisians getting involved in sort of the administrative structure of the Islamic State. Of course, there are fighters as well, but, the head of the oil and gas facilities essentially in the Deir ez-Zor and Hasaka regions of Syria was being run by the Tunisian Abu Sayyaf, who people might remember that the U.S. Delta Forces actually did a raid against back in 2016, if I remember correctly, and killed him. But you also had other people in more mid-level administrative positions. And one of the interesting things is that when ISIS first went into Syria, they're trying to sort of rehabilitate their image of all the excesses that they did in Iraq in the prior decade. So they're doing these dawah events in, Raqqa and Aleppo and elsewhere. And one of the key figures in these events was this Tunisian called Abu Waqas al-Tunisi. So he was one of the key faces in this sort of soft power approach that ISIS was originally trying to do in Syria before people realized that, they weren't really changed that much. They just were trying to put a different veneer on things. So that was an important moment for the group too in that regard. But then you also had people like Rayyan al-Tunisiya, who was this woman that was a Tunisian who was the one who helped found the Al-Khansa Brigade, which is the infamous women-led sort of Hizbah-like patrol where they did vigilantism and moral policing type activities amongst the women that were involved in the Islamic State's apparatus. So, you had a number of Tunisians involved in some of these activities. And actually, Rayyan, alongside this other Tunisian, actually were the ones who helped torture the Jordanian pilot before he was lit on fire when he had been captured after his, plane didn't work anymore. So there are Tunisians involved for sure at higher and lower levels. And what was interesting too is that, when they did the breaking of the borders video, which was, they're trying to signify that they broke Sykes-Picot borders. One of the people in the video was actually a Tunisian as well, and the rest were, either Syrians or Iraqis. And then there's Umar al-Shishani as well too. But it was interesting that there was a Tunisian involved in this also and did a speech in one of those videos highlighting his significance also.
Right, and there's something I've been interested in was reading about the anti-terror forces in Tunisia. And from what I can gather, they've been pretty good at stopping ISIS or jihadi attacks in Tunisia in the last couple of years. But I'm wondering, like, do you think that's because they're good, or it's just because they all kind of went to Syria?
I think there's a number of reasons why they've gotten better. So, the thing to remember is that after 2011, there was a lot of interest in trying to reform the security sector because it had been previously an authoritarian regime, and the Interior Ministry was extremely abusive against most of the population. And therefore, for many years, they're still following the same MO that, if they found somebody that was involved in something, then they would do like a dragnet essentially against family members or cousins or acquaintances, instead of really doing discriminate, intelligence-led sort of policing type of work. And there are still some issues related to that to this day, but you really started to see more serious efforts at reform in the aftermath of the large-scale attacks we saw in 2015 and 16 with the Bardo National Museum attack, the Sousse Beach attack, the attack on the presidential guard bus in November of 2015, and then also the failed attempt by the Islamic State to take over the town or the city of Ben Gardan, which is close to the Libyan border. So the thing to remember is that the main attacks that happened by ISIS, these larger scale ones, were actually being planned and based in Libya by the Tunisian network in Libya after the Islamic State had set it itself up there. So they were based in this town of Sabratha, which is just on the other side of the Tunisian-Libyan border. And then after all these actions, as part of sort of the anti-ISIS campaign within Libya too, the U.S. actually did this large-scale airstrike against this camp in Sabratha and killed like allegedly 55 people or so, but that pretty much hurt a lot of the key players and leaders and assets within this Tunisian network that was doing external operations into Tunisia at the time. And then a number of other individuals who then were involved in the attempt to take over of Ben Gardan either were killed or arrested. So that really degraded a lot of the network related to these larger scale attacks versus sort of the more amateurish type of homegrown plotting that we've seen over the years in Tunisia. Obviously, you still had that network in the mountains close to Algeria too, but again, similar to AQIM, they really haven't been able to do that many attacks, usually 3 to 5 attacks a year mostly. And similar to AQIM, they're mainly against just the security services, whether military, police people, and not really against civilians like we saw with the external operations coming from Libya. So because of the anti-ISIS campaign in Libya, that really made it a lot easier on sort of the police within Tunisia in regards to sort of dealing with plots within the country itself on the homegrown basis. But then also through training with the US, with the EU, as well as others, they've just gotten a lot smarter with dealing with this. And one of the things that I've noticed, at least since 2018, is that they've been a lot more discriminate about who they're arresting and how many people they're arresting. And you don't see sort of these large-scale numbers of arrests in the same way you had previously, where it seemed like they're just doing arrests for the sake of it to show that they're doing something. And what's interesting, in April 2019, or I think it was April 2019, maybe it was 2018, I can't remember off the top of my head now. But they essentially said that they're no longer on the defensive anymore against the jihadi movement, and sort of trying to put, it came out of Pandora's box back into the box after 2011, and that they're more on the offensive now. And therefore, it's created greater room for, more of these reforms within the police, as well as Interior Ministry. I shouldn't say that it's like, 100% success, or that, they're acting like police in maybe like Denmark or Switzerland would act, or something along those lines. But compared to, the Ben Ali era prior to 2011, they're headed in the right direction, and they're being a lot smarter with it, and trying to do it more now in conjunction with other actors within the government too. Whether it's related to the prison system, whether it's related to the judiciary. Of course, there's a lot of work still to be done in terms of coordination to make it more in line with the rule of law, as well as just more efficient and smarter, as well as being transparent too. But at least for now, it seems like they're headed in the right direction when you're talking about this, not just in the context of jihadism, but just generally a country transitioning from authoritarian rule to a democracy.
Mm-hmm. Earlier you mentioned about Ansar al-Sharia. I remember reading quite a bit about them like years ago, about 5 years ago now. And, you know, you're saying they're kind of like Tunisian Al-Qaeda types, but didn't they convert to ISIS in the end?
No, they didn't. So essentially, as I noted, the group was created after the revolution in around May 2011, and then they're designated by the government in August 2013. And they continue to try and still do stuff for a little while, pretty much through December 2013. But after that, they then, until about the summer 2014, just put out like propaganda statements and the like, but not actually doing activities on the ground. And then the group essentially just became defunct. What essentially happened is that a lot of the networks related to the activism within Tunisia that Ansar al-Sharia created, for those individuals that were leaders in AST that then defected to ISIS, just then repurposed those networks. But the organization as itself never, went for ISIS or anything. It was more some leaders within the group were just like, yeah, I'm ditching AQ type of deal. So you had people like Abu Ja'far al-Hattab, Kamal Zarruq, Boubacar al-Hakim, Bilal Shawashi, as well as others, and essentially repurpose some of the networks related to recruitment for activities within Tunisia, and then channel them into recruiting people to then become foreign fighters in Libya or Syria and Iraq. So that was more what happened, is that there was just a cannibalization of some of the networks, but the organization itself never went for it. And, by the summer of 2014, it was essentially defunct anyways.
Got you. Aaron, tell us about your book. It's out now, right? What's it all about?
Yeah, so some of the conversation we've already having is a lot of it is based off of the book. So my book is essentially a history of the Tunisian jihadi movement. In the aftermath of the revolution, at the time, jihadis were mainly on password-protected forums putting out their propaganda. And I saw one day in May 2011, there's an announcement for this forum for this new group called Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia. I was like, this is interesting. We're only like about 4 months out of the revolution, and most people talk about Tunisia compared to most Arab states, relatively speaking, as relatively secular, cosmopolitan. What's going on here? And that sort of just brought me down this rabbit hole where I was like trying to answer this question, like why was there this essentially explosion, or why people mobilizing to jihadi movement in Tunisia? And therefore, I know that most people are more interested in all this stuff related to ISIS and the more recent thing because it's been in the news, and like there's so many Tunisians with ISIS and it seems kind of strange. But for me, looking back towards the history prior to 2011 was the most interesting, just so you could see the development of who these people were and the networks and how they transformed over time, and they were able to mutate depending on which group was the hottest at the time, which conflict was the coolest one to go to, and how essentially they just switched the networks to whatever that was, but it was still the same people involved in many respects. And that really provided the basis for understanding why there was such robust, networks. And what we then saw after 2011, without that history, it's really impossible to get at why they were really successful in what they're doing. And then, essentially, I talk about, sort of the policy of the government after 2011 and the reasons why they got into sort of this light touch approach, and how AST was able to take advantage of it through their particular strategy, as well as lessons learned within Al-Qaeda related to what they saw in Iraq. And then also, related to how their strategy ended up ultimately failing, because inherently there is violence within the ideology, and the Dawah first approach was, just not sustainable. And there's a reason why I always say Dawah first, is because it's like jihad second or jihad after that, however you want to describe it. And that got into Hizbah-related violence, which is more of the vigilantism, as well as the actual overt attacks like the one on the embassy and the assassinations. But then with, the closing of the group by the government, essentially, this influx of Tunisians in the spring 2013 through spring of 2014, this huge outflow of Tunisians to ISIS. and then what that all meant in terms of when people started to return home, as well as the development of the network in Libya, and then how the Tunisians themselves on a governmental level then were able to sort of combat this once you saw those large-scale attacks in 15 and 16, and where they are today now, where it's relatively stable, it's pretty safe, you don't really hear about too many attacks now. Usually whenever there's one, it's really amateurish and small scale, and it's usually one or two people involved. It's very low tech. It's all done at home type of deal. There's really no external operations present. Of course, there have been cases where the Tunisian government has arrested people who have been involved in being coached by ISIS abroad. There was just a case last week where they arrested an individual who was talking to ISIS members in Libya and Syria about planning a potential attack there during last year's election, actually. But overall, comparatively speaking now, things are relatively calm within the country. The thing I think about most in terms of the future trajectory of the movement is two things. One, if you're looking internal to the country of Tunisia, is the prisoner population. So in the same way you have sort of a similar dynamic you had prior to 2011 within the prison system, wherein, part of the prisons are essentially being run by jihadis in the same way you see like gangs do in, the U.S. prison system or what have you. And as a result, people are worried about what that could mean in terms of what can happen when these people are let out, but it also undermines the ability for them to try and do sort of rehabilitation, reintegration for those that are truly trying to, go back to regular life and are trying to quit the jihadi movement, just because of the social pressures within the prison system itself for people to remain within sort of the milieu, essentially. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is related to what, this unfolding that we continue to see in northeast Syria with the Kurds and the SDF controlling the prisoners with ISIS in Hasaka, as well as also, the women and children in the IDP camps in Al-Hol in particular, but also the other smaller ones too. And what that can mean for the future, whether in terms of ISIS breaking these people out, like we saw with the Breaking the Walls campaign in Iraq, 7 or 8 years ago now, and how that could flood potential Tunisians back into combat roles or as administrative roles if ISIS starts to potentially take over territory, or maybe in sort of a shadow governance type of way, since we have seen ISIS beginning to levy taxes on people in Iraq and Syria again, as well as sometimes setting up checkpoints for extortion and other things. So I worry about that. And, just the other day, there's another prison riot within the prisons where these ISIS guys are being held in SDF-controlled territories in northeast Syria. So there's those two dynamics related to the internal and external of where things are headed now.
Yeah, and I know there's quite a few Tunisians in those prisons that you're talking about. Is the government in Tunisia, are they taking them back, or are they just ignoring it like we do in the West?
Well, the funny thing is, because Tunisia is actually a democracy, unlike all the other Arab states, they actually are mirroring what's going on in the West, where there's a lot of reticence of bringing these guys back. It should be noted, though, over the years, 1,000 people have returned to Tunisia. Of course, a lot of it has to do with disillusionment, so that's part of the reason why you haven't seen people that have come back getting involved again and sort of plotting. There have been some cases where people have gone back and then tried to do something again, but it's been really small. But the ones that are the most hardcore are still the ones that are in northeast Syria that, are fighting to the last breath in Baghuz, and they don't necessarily want to, go back to their normal lives, like some that might have been disillusioned by what they saw in Iraq and Syria when they returned home. But the thing is, there's also a constituency within Tunisia, because it is a democracy, and Tunisia's civil society is actually very robust and active. Many of them don't want these people to return, essentially saying that, these aren't truly Tunisians, that they shouldn't be allowed to come back for the heinous crimes that they've committed. So there's a lot of barriers politically for bringing them back as well, just because it's not a popular thing to do. So the politicians have to think in the same way, we see with, these decisions that have gone on in various Western states as well. But because of that, it's creating this lingering, festering issue in northeast Syria, just like you see with the Western citizens, or I guess those that maybe have been stripped citizenship too, there as well, and what that could mean in the future too, if they're ever broken out of prison, as some people, including myself, fear in the more, whenever that could potentially happen, and what that means in terms of the insurgencies in Iraq and Syria, but also what that can mean in terms of potentially for external operations back into Tunisia, because these guys are probably pissed off. So obviously it's hard to predict specifically what could happen in the future, but just continuing to allow nothing to happen on the front with these foreigners in general, and Tunisians specifically in this case, to just remain there is not, a sustainable solution to any of this.
Yeah, I keep thinking every time there's a prison riot, it's going to be, eventually one is going to kind of break the camel's back, I think, and they are all going to get out. Do you know what I mean? But I don't know, hopefully not. Aaron, I just want to talk a little bit about jihadology briefly, because I've been on your site, I listened to the podcast back in the day, loads, very, very helpful. Maybe you can explain, what is jihadology and what do you do there?
Yeah, sure. First, I'll note on the prison break thing, too. The thing to remember is that everybody always talked about when they broke out Taji and Abu Ghraib in the Breaking the Walls campaign. But there were a number of prior attempts to that as well. It just wasn't successful. We only saw the successful ones later. So even though we're not seeing successes now, it shouldn't necessarily be a good sign, in my opinion. But in terms of my website, Jihadology, so it's actually almost the 10-year anniversary of it. Later this month will be the 10-year anniversary when I created the website after I finished my master's. And essentially, I created it in the aftermath when I finished my master's, because my master's thesis was on sort of the evolution and Islamist ideology that led to Al-Qaeda sort of from the fall of the caliphate in 1924 through the beginning of Al-Qaeda at the end of the Afghan jihad in the late 1980s. And so I was, looking through, trying to find primary sources related to things to help me with this research at the time. And, it's not like in college they necessarily taught you how to find jihadi content online, especially back in like 2008 to 2010 time period, where things, even though it's like 7, 8 years, 9 years after 9/11, a lot of the academic issues related to it still hadn't caught up to the realities. Now I think it's a lot better in terms of teaching students related to this that are interested in how to find it and process it and do it in a serious and rigorous manner, and also doing it ethically and things along those lines. But at the time, there wasn't really that same kind of setup in a lot of parts of academia. So I kind of just was figuring it out myself over time. But I figured, if, I was having issues with this, maybe other graduate students were. And that was the original impetus, essentially, for the website, was to create it for other graduate students so that they would have access to the documents. Of course, I never honestly thought it would become what it became, and that, so many people use it beyond just graduate students, of course. Since then, I've, beyond just primary sources, people have done guest posts and analysis on it. I've done different features over time, like the podcast or like my articles of the week thing about key articles that people have written about the movement, or, doing specific series like when bin Laden died, I collated a bunch of responses within the movement about what was going on, or the initial responses from the jihadi movement related to the various uprisings in the Arab world in 2011 and 12. And then more recently, creating pages related to responses of, jihadis in Syria, as well as the SDF and the Assad regime related to coronavirus, just from a comparative perspective, just because it's something interesting and different in terms of comparing how these different actors operate within the same country, but different administrations, because different parts of Syria are being controlled by different actors. So, there's a ton of stuff. And I mean, now there's more than 15,000 different posts on the website. It's nearing maybe 1 terabyte worth of data on the website of content now, I think, so there's a ton there. And the thing is like, it's always funny. People act like I look at all this stuff myself. I'm like, mainly just saving and uploading it so other people can look at it, because there's no way I could look at all this stuff during the day, because there's so much content, and there's so much content on there that still can be exploited. So I always urge people to try and find stuff on there that hasn't people haven't done research on and looked at yet. I know that, it's popular to look at like the English language magazines, and that's easy, but there's so much more out there that could be used to better understand these movements that nobody's even looked at yet, which is mind-numbing, just because there is so much primary source content out there, and the way that we could better understand these movements and better understand their histories. I mean, that's part of the reason why I was happy that I was able to do my book about the history of the Tunisian jihadi movement, because even though it became a larger issue later, when I first started looking into it, most people were like, whatever, Tunisians, jihadis, who cares? There's not that many of them, type of deal. But the thing is, you might find something that, might not be relevant today, but could easily be important later on. Or just for a general knowledge base, just to provide greater depth of understanding of certain issue. Or maybe disproving or arguing against the way somebody might have looked at an issue previously, because they might have missed some documentation, or maybe misinterpreted something, or there's new evidence that suggests something otherwise. So, I just hope people are able to, I know people are using it, but in other ways beyond just sort of necessarily the ways a lot of people already use it now.
Yeah, I've been on it before, and just like 3 hours have just gone, you know what I mean? Just like gone into a rabbit hole, man. I think it's so good. Didn't you get censored before? That was something I always wanted to ask. I remember vaguely a story where the British government tried to censor it or something, no?
Yeah, so they were like harassing me for a good 2 to 3 years, the Home Office as well as the Metropolitan Police, about my website, essentially saying that, my website was supporting jihadis, which obviously it isn't. It's a research mechanism. And it's funny because the same people are using my website themselves, a bunch of hypocrites. But anyways, I mean, obviously the environment's different with ISIS, but also because there are all the crackdowns against a lot of this content on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter. Of course, it's not perfect, but it did eliminate a lot of stuff. And therefore, my website became one of the few stable locations where this content was up. But even that being said, there have been studies that have come out since by some people showing sort of the links that jihadis are using on Telegram. And this is before my website became password protected about 13 months ago, where it showed that, yes, there were links to stuff from my website, but it was like less than 1% of the time. So it's kind of ridiculous. Like, if you're within your own milieu and subculture and ecosystem online, they're not going to care about my website. They're going to want to do it with their own social movement. So as a result, I thought it was a bit overblown and ridiculous. But because I kept on getting pressure, and one of the things I said is, look, I do this website in my free time. I'm not making any money off of this type of deal. Like, I'm just doing it for just the passion of doing it and better understanding this stuff, and also helping everybody else out in the field, and hopefully better educating people. Look, I don't have the money to change things, and I certainly don't have the software engineering type of background to change the website so it's sophisticated. And eventually, after the Global Internet Forum for Countering Terrorism, which is a consortium between Facebook, Google, Twitter, and Microsoft, the UK government started pressuring them through them to get me to do stuff to add this password protection. And, through the tech companies with their money, and then with Tech Against Terrorism, which is an NGO related to the UN, who had the sort of software engineering backgrounds and skills and data science type of project, we're able, over sort of the year prior to fully implementing the password protection, which came live April 2019, come up with a plan to make it a way where I was still happy with the website, and it still felt like it was my website, and that I still had full control, and that it wouldn't make, the aesthetics shitty or anything, and that everything was still pretty much the same. You just needed to, log on or what have you, as long as you have a legitimate email address. And, that's anybody that's, a student, journalist, government, diplomat, humanitarian worker, anybody that would use it for a legitimate purpose, essentially, could get on, and there hasn't been any issues. It's just a matter of, if there's not a domain that has been whitelisted yet, then somebody will email me and I'll add it to the whitelist. So Relatively speaking, it's been pretty successful since then. Obviously, I'm still kind of bitter against the UK government, as I'm sure you could probably tell, maybe.
As you should be. It's outrageous, to be honest.
Yeah, especially since it's not even like my own government, so it's kind of ridiculous because nobody in the US government has ever really cared. I mean, they've always understood it. And I think it also shows how little the UK government sort of understands this stuff. It's like they literally let these guys operate in their own country for 15 years unmolested. You know, the whole Londonistan scene and moniker that they had, and it's like, you're pointing fingers at me. And the funny thing is that there's all these like websites that have been created in the last year by Al-Qaeda specifically that are still up and nobody's done anything about it. But little old me, I guess I'm an easy target because I'm just one individual. But, you know, it is what it is. People are still using it for research, and there's, you know, so I'm happy about that. So, you know, we'll see where things go, but it's you know, still running. It's not centered or anything. It's still up. Just have a password protection now. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. It's really dumb because, you know, I had friends going to mosques in London that were like, you know, we've had to speak to the police because a certain guy at our mosque is becoming very extreme and we're worried about it. You know, you're talking about the Muslim community contacting the police themselves, being like, hey, you need to check this guy out. We're worried about him. And the police do absolutely nothing about it. But then they go after a website. Like, it's kind of, I don't know, the way the police work like this, the anti-terror police specifically, is very strange. Anyway, mate, let's plug all your stuff, man. What's your book called? Where can people get it? And where can people follow you online?
Yeah, so my book is Your Sons Are at Your Service, Tunisia's Missionaries of Jihad. You can pretty much get it anywhere online where you'd find a book, but, you know, main one obviously is probably Amazon. But you could also get it on the Columbia University Press website, and if you get it there and you use the discount code CUP30, you can get 30% off the price. So obviously that might be of interest to students or those that don't necessarily want to pay as much money. Though the price of the Kindle version is cheaper than the paperback version. And then in terms of you know, Twitter, I'm at Zelin for those interested. And then of course, if you do want to follow my website, it's jihadology.net. So yeah, see y'all online, I guess.
Thank you very much, mate. That was really, really interesting.
Yeah, no worries at all.
That was Aaron Zelin speaking about Tunisian jihad and briefly about jihadology, where the stupid British government tried to censor it, or did censor it. Definitely check out jihadology.net if you're at all interested in learning about jihadism in a very unfiltered, non-sanitized way. You know, it's really good. Jihadology is I think, very, very valuable to the kind of conflict research community. Like I said at the start, thank you all very much for participating in the Help the Homeless charity raffle. We raised over $4.5 grand. I've sent it all off to the charities, and I'm currently spending my days writing all the names on little raffle tickets, which I will pull out of a hat live, probably on the Instagram, just to do it. I just think live is probably a better idea, so no one can chat shit. I guess they could either way, but whatever. Yeah, we're gonna do that. Definitely by the end of May, probably next week. It's just like there's over 1,000 entries, so I've got to write. I think it is anyway. So I've got to write all them out. But yeah. If you like what we're doing, as usual, please do consider supporting us on the Patreon. Go to patreon.com/popularfront. You get bonus episodes, narrated articles, access to the Discord, all sorts of stuff there. And if you don't like Patreon, you can support us at popularfront.co/support. You can send us, you know, like donations, whatever, via Bitcoin, normal money, whatever you want. popularfront.co/support. Remember, we basically survive on all of that. This is all grassroots, no corporate bullshit. So thank you very much if you are supporting. Also, you could buy our merchandise at popularfront.shop. Yeah, you can look cool while supporting. This episode was sponsored by thedefensepost.com. Defense with an S. Go there for regular updates on the world in conflict. Also sponsored by our mates at Oracle Coffee Shop in Portland, Oregon, USA. They're an independent coffee shop selling only fair trade products. Go see them at 3875 Southwest, Bond Avenue 97239. Tell them Popular Front sent you. Hopefully soon they will be back open, because we're hoping that, all over the place these lockdown restrictions kind of chill out a little bit, but who knows. The episode is also sponsored by Black Triangle, an independent company manufacturing their own low-key self-defense tools. Thank you very much. They donated some of these tools to the Popular Front Help the Homeless raffle. Check them out on Instagram at Black Triangle Group, or their website blacktriangle.com, but it's spelled BLK, right? So blktriangle.com. Tell them Popular Front sent you. What they're doing is cool, all independent, like I said. The episode is also sponsored by our mates at Fengtings. Fengtings, basically they're doing custom Baofeng radios and advice on how to basically use them and tune into whatever. I got one that's very interesting, I think, something I'm fascinated with, like ham radio, shortwave, all of that. Go to instagram.com/feng.tings, spelled TINGZ. In the UK, like Pengtings is like basically saying someone's attractive, so it's kind of a joke on that. Fengtings on Instagram, direct message Callum there, and he's doing like really cool stuff, basically building up the Baofengs with all these really good aerials, bigger batteries, and also doing custom paint jobs. Like he's got all these camouflage graffiti things. I don't know, it's interesting. A lot of people said, what's the thing with the Baofeng? It's just interesting. Like a lot of people that are fascinated with Popular Front generally are interested in what we're interested in, and it's like a nerdy bit of fun, really. You kind of tune into different shortwave radio stuff. You can track military planes and all sorts of stuff with them. It's really cool. Instagram.com/feng.tings. Do subscribe to us on YouTube. We'll have another doc out by the end of the month. Go to youtube.com/popularfront, subscribe, hit the bell. It's the only way you'll be notified, because again, we're whatever the YouTube equivalent of a shadow ban is, we are that. Like, whole channel completely demonetized, doesn't really come up in searches that are relevant. So yeah, that's what happens. Independent, blah blah. Twitter, follow me at Jake_Hanrahan, HANRAHAN, or at Popular Front CO. The Instagram is instagram.com/popular.front. You'll have to type the whole thing in because we're shadow banned there too. Happy days. And for the website, www.popularfront.co. Go there. A lot of people contact me through there. I'm really sorry I don't have time anymore to reply to everything. It's not me being rude, it's just Popular Front has become so big now that on my own it's very hard to deal with, you know what I mean? And we don't make enough money to hire people yet, so it is what it is. It's good, it's a good problem to have, don't get me wrong, but just so you know, I'm not being rude. And thank you to the following Patreons. Thank you very much, because you are keeping this afloat. They are Adam Berg-Snyder, Amy Rupert, Andrew Hurley, Anthony Kobarek, Axel Iverson, Azad, Bill Wilson, Brian McLaughlin, Trey Nance, Chad Walker, Charlie, Chris, Christina Rivetti, Christopher Martin, DR, Dan Dunham, Daniel Shearer, Degenerate Zero Alpha, alright, Diana Gorvanek, Dong Wayne, Emiliano, Emily Molly, Fletcher Tate, Fragile Feeling, Frank Austin, James from the Discord, Joanne Stocker, Josh, Jungle King Virapam, Lawrence Abrahams, Liam Williams, Luis Nicastro, do let me know if I've said that wrong, Moritz Zumwal, Ari, Olin Thorne, Patrick Bronte, Peter McCormick from What Bitcoin Did and Defiance, Cuball, Rubicon, Ryan Sandercock, Scatoon Music, Sebastian, Sarushe Hawazi, Stephen Davila, Tony Bin, and Vida Provost. Thank you very much. And some people contacted me, a lot of people have had to unsubscribe from the Patreon because Corona has affected the economy and is affecting people's jobs, and so many people are messaging me saying, I'm so sorry. Please, honestly, I understand it, mate. Do not worry. You do not have to say sorry. It's not like, I get it. You're not saying we don't like Popular Front, mate. Money situations, trust me, I had them bad my whole life. You do not have to say sorry. Please do not say sorry. I hate that. There is no sorry. Like, honestly, I get it. Trust me. Recession is coming. We all know. It's understandable. It is what it is. But yeah, thank you very much to the Patreons. Really appreciate that. And if you're not a Patreon, you can get a lot of cool stuff. Like, every month there's a minimum of 2 bonus episodes. I don't know how many there are now, like nearly 60. And the bonus episodes are different. It's not just like Popular Front. It's kind of like Popular Front 2 in a way. Like, we almost get a little bit more niche with them. There's a lot of historical stuff there. It's kind of different. I enjoy doing them. It's good fun. And also, you know, access to the Popular Front Discord, watchlist gang. Like, anyone that's in there will tell you what a good community we have there. It's like big community of weirdos, misfits, and we all get on, and it's not bullshit, and no one's scared to like talk out and be blah blah, you know. No frills, no elitism, as we say, but no cliques either. Like, none of that. Don't like that. You know, I've heard some people say, oh, like, Popular Front's like the cool kids of like the new conflict, blah blah. We're not the cool kids, mate. Like, there is no cool kids. That's tired. Like, forget that. It's just people that get along with each other and openly talk to each other and are not full of shit. You know what I mean? It's good. So anyway, thank you all very much for the support. Patreon.com/popularfront or popularfront.co/support. Music in this episode, the intro is by Home and the outro is by Sam Black, alias Son of Old. Go to samblackpf.com to listen to his music.